Welcome to another episode of the Bees and Honey podcast. Today we speak with Ivan Gaete, a Chilean artist who lives and works in the Bronx, and he's a fascinating person, fascinating to speak to hear the ideas behind his work. And he tells us a little bit about the New York City Bronx art scene, which in and of itself is something new for me as well. Hope you enjoy it. What I love about Anchor is that it's given me creative control of my own material. I was approached by a big company to do a podcast about the art world, and I didn't want to sign over all rights to them. Anchor has allowed me to make this podcast and to keep creative control as well as financial control in terms of advertising. Anchor gives you everything you need in one place for free. You can use it on your phone or your computer. There are tools that help you to upload your recordings that you've done separately or on the app. They'll distribute it for you as well, which again, I couldn't wrap my mind around distribution, and they have it all there for you in one place: Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and many more. You can easily make money from it as well. They help you advertise. As you can see right now, I'm getting my first ad out through Anchor. And all you have to do is download the app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Good luck with your podcast and getting your voice out there and owning your content. So today we're speaking with Ivan Gaete, who is originally from Chile. And Ivan, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your work and how you started out as an artist, and how you think things will be working out in the next few weeks or months with your work.
Sure. So, I mostly create works on paper. Even though I've been, moving away from paper, I'm now actually interested more and more in textiles. And in terms of the work that I do is usually begins with observation. Something piques my interest, maybe a material, it could be a piece of something, and I tend to accumulate things, just sort of like I'm a little bit of a
hoarder.
Yeah, I must confess.
Right.
Yeah, I'm a little bit. But things that nobody would hoard, like just sort of like a thread, I don't know, a plastic little cup, things that, if I order food, maybe a container, these kind of things that, that are in your life are sort of like, and that just go to the trash. So I like to think that I'm always conscious of my footprint and thinking about what I can do with something that you would otherwise throw to the trash.
Right.
And so that's part of it, and so I accumulate things, but I also accumulate ideas, and information, and I'm always sort of making lists and I don't know, just grouping and classifying information. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's through this cumulative process that sometimes leads to larger ideas, or that it might create relationship between two different ideas that I might be working with. Let's say a material, and then maybe something that I keep seeing in a newspaper.
Right.
And so it's sort of like through the combination of sometimes of this physical kind of world and the kind of more the mind world that connects, and where things connect, and I follow my intuition, and it just sometimes get very obsessive about something and just go into it, like for a certain time, and just dig deeper, because I think it's also about digging deeper within yourself, but we also, like, in terms of the information that that might interest you, start like searching and pulling more data, but it also, like, I think going internally into why are these things important to you.
Right. And also important to everyone else too. I think the last thing I saw of yours had to do with the newspapers, literally a newspaper clippings that you had. Can you tell us about that piece and about the group exhibition that you were in?
Sure. So that was actually a really great show, because It was at the, an institution that has a beautiful space.
What's the institution?
It's Macmillan.
Macmillan.
Yeah. So I love that space because the amount of light and the amount of space. It's
in Dumbo.
And it's a non-profit organization, supporting artists now for quite a long time. I mean, Dumbo now is, super chic, but but it's not always was like that. No. And they've been around for a long time, always supporting artists. And so, and they were, just very supportive in general. But also the curator, which is Ivan Gaete Davis, she was what I love about it is that she trusted me, with the project. Usually I do installations. That's what I love to do. And so she said, "Well, what do you need?" And we started the conversation, and she came to see some of the ideas that I had, and she said, "Just go for it." And so when you're entrusted with something like that, then you kind of really can flow. And so the piece turned out to be basically probably 4,000 or 5,000 headlines of the New York Times.
Wow.
I guess initially my first goal, or the initial goal or idea that I had in mind, was that I wanted to quantify or get a sense visually of how much information we are receiving on a regular basis, because you're like bombarded, every day with so much news, and I have a hard time just keeping up.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not a fast reader. I mean, I'm more of a visual person, so I love images, and so when it comes to text information, I just have a harder time processing because I'm just very detail oriented, and and so it's a hard thing for me to deal with, and so. But if I kind of visualize it and see what does it look like, and I'll be able to maybe get a better sense of what I'm dealing with. And so that was the first thought, that came with that piece, which I named Unwoven, because it was the idea of like pulling kind of like the fabric, that makes the news. It kind of like, just pulling it apart.
Unwoven.
Right. Yeah. And so it does refers in a way to textiles, which is my interest, I've been...
And that installation had several parts, like...
Yeah, it was basically like a 4-part sculpture, it's like a soft sculptures. I mean, I don't really think of them as sculptures per se, but my work has become sculptural, without me wanting to call them sculptures, but I guess because they have a physical presence, they're like more 3D. Right. They have moved away from drawing to become sculptural, but always working with materials that are soft, which this basically were all made out of the newspapers, out of the New York Times. There are basically 3 or 4 months of the New York Times that I accumulated, from which I cut the headlines, and then I sort of stapled them together, like groups of 10.
Right.
I was thinking of the decimal system, and then sort of like stack them up horizontally and vertically to kind of create a sort of like a textile that reminds of fringe.
Right.
I was thinking about the idea of movement, that the fringe has been around for a long time, since early civilizations, the Mesopotamians, fringe was quite important for them. And I think the fringe also reflects on ideas of what as the edge, what is like at the edge of things, and sometimes that is what defines form, what is at the edge is what defines something. But it also has to do with ideas of the economy of materials, like indigenous people could use fringe, but they couldn't cut the leather because it was very expensive.
Right.
And so whatever was hanging, that would become the fringe.
Oh, okay.
You see, so it also talks about ideas of economy of material.
And it's also decoration in a way.
Decoration, yeah. And why is important decoration? I said it's really important, in these times where, like you even have to question what art is, if it's important.
Right.
And so I thought that the fringe, was a good concept to work with, and plus I love, I live in the Bronx nowadays, and I see a lot of car dealers, and they have this sort of like fringe that hangs, basically outside with just sort of like different colors, and I just love when the wind blows and moves them. It's sort of like they're like almost like just moving. I don't know. There's like something very
mystical about
because the wind, just because the wind is so invisible, you don't really get to see it, but you get to feel it,
right.
And so you hardly get to see influence that it has, but the wind is a very powerful force, that is affecting everything.
Well, there was also a level of interactivity with your sculpture or installation, because you invited the viewer to take one of the headlines,
correct,
and see what that related to in their own life or when they read it. Or
that was a quite important part of the piece. That's true. Thank you for pointing that out. For me, I do think that the interaction of what people bring into the work is important. I have, maybe through the years, I have learned to appreciate more and more the creativity of people, what people bring to the table. And, I'm always sometimes moved by, what people are able to create. I think that their collective creativity is much larger than what you can bring individually. And so I'm always thinking now, but from now a couple of, let's say 2 years or so, where after I did a couple of residencies, especially after the Laundromat project, where I became more conscious of the importance of, making people to participate, and what that brings, because you can learn so much from it. And so I wanted, people to participate somehow in the piece, and in this case it was about them pulling the headline, because the headline was just a headline with no context. You could find, if you search the New York Times, I'm sure you could find the article. They're available online, but just the title, because I think they're so suggestive, and sometimes they don't even have to do much with the story itself. It's sort of like something to pique your interest, or maybe something to summarize it, or the essence of the story. But it was really more about what you get from reading the headline, because the everything else was shredded and made into pulp. And so in other words, the stories were hidden. But I think that if you just pull one headline, you could kind of make up your own story
out of that
headline, and see what is what is the relation that you have with the story. So for me, that was the part that was kind of interactive, and I was also thinking a lot about, I always think about the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres, because I think that ever since I got to know his work, it's so sort of invasive in this way that penetrates your your body or your feelings, and you kind of mind, it has this emotional context. So I thought, I'm always thinking about his work, and and in a way the piece also was thinking of an homage in a way. I did a shredded part of the piece, was like a shredded triangle, and a corner which sort of remind of the candy that you can take out from the accumulation of candy. So this was an important part of the piece for sure.
Well, the idea of the information age through something which is sort of phasing out printed text is kind of cool too, because it's technological, like you said, the idea of the decimal and stuff like that, without using technology, which is really kind of cool if you think about it. But let's go back to the Bronx, because you said now you live in the Bronx, your studio is in the Bronx. You had an exhibition there a few years ago at the Bronx Museum, or what was that about?
Yes, well, I did. Basically, when I moved to the Bronx, the Bronx community have been incredibly supportive with me. I have been very lucky. I think part of the reasons I got the resident to do a program with the Bronx Museum called the AIM program, and I think one of the reasons I got it was because I was living in the Bronx, and so that was, I think, one of the, I don't know if that wasn't a requirement, but I think that influenced the fact that I was able to get that, to be part of that program. And the program ended basically with an exhibition in the museum.
What is the program about?
The program really focused on giving the artists, practical tools to work as artists in the terms of the professional development. It's called Artists in the Marketplace, and even though I am personally a bit against the idea of the marketplace, because I'm always, kind of internally having that fight, I think, because I'm, I guess, idealistic, and I think of life should be a poetry, and you should not think about markets and money and all of that. But there's also a pragmatic, aspect of it, and there's also a lot of our world or the art worlds, because there are many, and I know many art worlds. They're just different pockets of art worlds. They all have rules, and like even to apply for a program, you have to present an application. You have to have a proposal, etc. And so there are practical parts or practical elements that you kind of need to navigate, and this program is very helpful in that way. But I think the best takeaway that I have from that program was that you kind of meet with a group of artists that are kind of in the same boat that you are, and then it's sort of like it breaks a lot of the barriers that you or ideas, the preconceptions sometimes that you have in the world, that you're alone, and it kind of creates sort of a lot of a camaraderie. And so I have a lot of good friends, artists that came out from the same program, and I just have a really good relationship with them.
Well, that's cool.
And so anyways, but going back to the Bronx, right, I forgot the question.
Well, what's happening over there? What's the Bronx art scene like? Because I don't get uptown that far very often. But yeah, tell us about the exhibition at the Bronx, or what's going on. Like, what are they doing? Where do they go? How many artists are out there?
I mean, the Bronx always had an art scene and a lot of creativity. I think that because the creativity comes from a struggle, from the struggle of being, in a place where, that is very rooted. A lot of the people that live in the Bronx are people that have been in the Bronx, that were born and raised here. A lot of them, even though also a lot of immigrants, but I think that there are a lot of people that work hard, and that have to commute, and they're like, okay, I wouldn't say real New Yorkers, but but in a way they are,
salt of the earth New Yorkers.
Exactly, salt of the earth New Yorkers, and so I have a lot of respect for the people in the Bronx, and there is a large a lot of creativity, a large art scene in terms of from the graffiti to the hip hop artists, and that kind of community, and then I guess more recently also it's also living a lot of people that have studios now in the South Bronx, and there are organizations also that have been around for a long time, like the CDC, the Point, I call it the Point CDC, that also is very nurturing and sort of like does a lot of work with students and young people, to kind of make them aware, of art, and I think this is also an important aspect of it. There's a lot of organizations that are doing a lot of I think very inspiring work with the community in the Bronx. But it's not really a place for a lot of galleries or anything like that. Even though there are some like Works, but it's all happening really in the South Bronx. And in terms of the art community in general, there's I'm part of a curated side of artists called BX200. They've also been incredibly supportive, with my work. Currently doing a residency with the Shoshanna. They just open up a space, a temporary space. They always sort of take into these empty buildings or empty spaces, and so right now have a temporary studio space right off the Fordham Plaza Metro North.
Oh, that's cool.
And so it's a new building. They had this building up for probably a year and a half. They had there an exhibition from the Bronx Documentary Center, another really great organization in the Bronx, and with photographs, from the Bronx Documentary Center for the artists that belong there. And they basically removed this exhibition probably 3 or 4 months ago, and Shoshanna, I guess, had the opportunity to do something with the space. And so we're temporarily there. We don't know really for sure how long. We're 5 artists right now, and we'll probably have it until the end of the year, and then after that we're not sure.
We'll figure it out.
Figure it out.
I mean, the good thing about Shoshanna, because I know quite a few artists who have been with them for many years, even if that space ends, they'll help you find something else, and hopefully it's close to you. It may not be close to you, but they always sort of keep in touch with the artists that they've worked with and find something for them.
Yeah, they're a fantastic really organization. They're very and now especially because they're really doing work with the community in particular. They've been part of this residency, incorporates doing workshops, outside Fordham Plaza, so that you can work with the community, and I love that interaction with the people. I envision my future work being more involved, where where people have the opportunity to express their own creativity. I think that's how I envision it.
Well, just speaking with you, I remember I met a few years back Anita Durst. I used to see her quite a bit actually when I first was familiar with Shoshanna, and I'm going to reach out to her because I think she would be an interesting person as well for the podcast to talk about the contributions she and her family and the company have made to supporting artists in New York City.
Yeah, they have like so many locations, Shasham, I don't know how many, but they're like, if you look at their website, there's like a tons of events, and they're all really cool events, very participative, and doing good to the community. She came to the ribbon cutting ceremony. It just happened earlier this week, and cool. And it's an interesting space because it's all glass, and so it's almost, we call it a fishbowl.
Yeah. Oh wow.
Because I do feel like we all feel like a little like a fish,
and people can see inside while you're working.
People can see inside while you work. And at the beginning, it was for me it was really tough because I'm so private. I am extremely private, and so for me it was quite challenging. Initially, I thought, what can I do here to hide myself? And so.
But that's actually a good thing because it's pushing your limits.
Exactly.
How can you work in that space in your own privacy while other people are still looking?
Right.
Which is kind of a New York City situation anyways.
Exactly. But I think some of it is funny because I was so concerned that people will be looking in, and it turns out that people hardly have any time.
Don't even look. They don't even care.
They don't even care. Like they might take 5 seconds to like okay,
and then it's completely forgotten.
And then completely forgotten. They just keep on going about their business, And so it's funny, in that way. So I was like trying for what can I do to kind of engage people, or what can I do that would be accessible, for people, because people can come in, so I can only like see them from the outside. So I ended up basically doing something very simple, which is a work with Post-it notes. And I feel like the place needed like color. So I thought, well, what more than just bring a lot of color Post-it notes that are so bright, have a lot of color, and be like something maybe simple to work with. And then it turned out to be sort of like becoming a kind of a quilt, a moving quilt, I call it.
Wow.
Ended up cutting them in different shapes and making, triangles, in fact, and just more of making into kind of a mosaic. A temporary mosaic, I sort of, but really it was kind of an excuse to hide myself. I thought if I put a Post-it note,
like a curtain,
people won't see me able to actually do work in this space, But like I said, it's been sort of a revelation to find out that people actually don't look that much.
I mean, and that's the other thing too. We often think that we're so, this focus of stuff, but at the end of the day, everybody's the focus of themselves only.
Yes. Everybody's like, especially like in New York, where everybody's rushing and trying to get somewhere, and that is placed, and specifically is sort of a hub, where people are moving around. But do people get to, stick around sometimes, and like there's a plaza, so people, especially still now that there is not so cold, people come and sit, and and they look. There is also beautiful work of Diane Hebert that is facing toward the plaza, where I see a lot of people look and sit down and look at her work as well. And so I think that people I kind of appreciate the opportunity to see art, public art in the Bronx. And it's kind of like a nice. I think it's a nice
point of interest.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a nice point is to maybe begin a dialogue, or to start something that because I think public art is important.
Yeah, right. That's true. Well, tell me what you're going to work on next. Like, what are your plans? And I know you have the studio, but what is the next thing that you are focusing on work-wise?
Well, right now, mostly I'm doing a lot of learning and research. Like I said earlier, I'm interested in textiles, and basically in ideas of weaving, because I think that my conception of the world of the universe is something that is woven. And
wow, that's a quantum theory right there.
Right there.
Yeah.
It's like something woven. And I always think, well, God is somebody that has in their toolbox, they probably have I don't know, some threads, and then some needles, and like, he's like just sort of like, knitting the world,
Yes,
or weaving
yes,
the
yes.
world, or crocheting the world, or macrame in the world.
And
you
we're,
know,
we're all just the threads that are coming together.
exactly. There's a beautiful poem that is called "The Master Weaver." You know,
Who is it by?
it's anonymous. You know,
wow.
nobody knows who wrote it, but it's a beautiful poem because exactly it talks about like the threads. You know, that each of us is a thread, and sometimes you don't know like in the larger piece what how important or that thread is to the whole, and how important is every thread, because one thread is missing, then the whole fabric could come apart, right?
That is a very that's deep right there. One thread is missing and the whole fabric can come apart.
And so I love this idea that we're all interwoven, and that and so that's why my interest in textiles, and I'm just, I guess, thinking of ideas of bringing all these different mediums of ways of creating textiles together and see what that can create.
Yes, and that also somehow, like you said, relates to indigenous cultures, indigenous people, indigenous art, and also art history as well, when you think of tapestries or stuff that people did. Anyway, I think we've done a really great job here talking, and I really look forward to seeing what you're up to next, and thank you for making this time to talk with us.
Thank you for having me here.
Okay, thanks, Ivan.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.